5 years ago, Vera left Alpha King Draven standing at the altar in front of his entire court, vanishing into the night without a single word of explanation. She told herself leaving was the only way to protect him from a truth she couldn't bear to speak aloud. Now, ruined, hunted by debts and enemies she never asked for, she has nowhere left to turn but back to the man she betrayed, praying he still has room in his heart for the woman who broke it. Vera hadn't planned to return to the capital. She'd sworn, the night she fled her own wedding, that she'd rather die in some forgotten corner of the kingdom than face Draven's fury again. But 5 years of running had finally caught up to her. Her small trading business, built painstakingly from nothing, had collapsed under debts she never should have taken. The men she owed weren't the forgiving sort, and the only protection left in the entire kingdom that any sane person would refuse to challenge belonged to the Alpha King she'd humiliated before his own court. She stood outside the palace gates now, travel-worn and desperate, throat tight with 5 years of buried shame. "State your business," the guard said, eyeing her ragged cloak with obvious suspicion. "Tell the king," Vera said, voice barely steady, "that Vera has returned." The guard's eyes widened slightly, recognition flickering despite the years. He disappeared through the gate without another word, leaving her alone with the weight of what she'd just set in motion. When Draven finally appeared, dark and imposing in the archway, his amber eyes found hers with an intensity that made her knees weaken. "You have exactly one reason," he said quietly, "to be standing here instead of buried in whatever hole you crawled into after abandoning me at that altar. Give it to me. Now." Vera's breath caught. 5 years of rehearsed apologies evaporated entirely in the face of his controlled fury. "I need your help," she whispered. "And I owe you the truth I never gave you. Both, if you'll allow me the chance." Chapter 1. Draven led her into a private receiving chamber. Guards stationed outside the door with obvious instructions to remain close should their king require them. The room was smaller than Vera remembered from her brief time in this palace years ago, intimate in a way that made the tension between them feel even heavier. Walls lined with old tapestries depicting battles fought generations before either of them had been born. "Sit," he said, not unkindly, though the coldness in his voice made clear this wasn't forgiveness, merely tolerance. "You have 5 minutes to explain yourself before I decide whether you deserve even that much of my time, Vera. 5 years is a considerable debt to repay with a handful of sentences." Vera lowered herself into the offered chair, hands trembling in her lap despite her best effort to appear composed. The chair felt too large, too formal, a stark reminder of exactly how far she'd fallen from the woman who'd once been expected to sit beside him as queen. "5 years ago," she began, forcing steadiness into her voice. "2 nights before our wedding, I overheard a conversation between your treasury advisors. They spoke of using our marriage as justification to seize farmland from the border villages. My village, Draven. Land my family and neighbors had worked for 3 generations. Land that meant the difference between survival and starvation for people who had nothing else. That's absurd," Draven said flatly, arms crossing over his broad chest.
"I never authorized any such seizure. My Treasury Council has never once presented such a proposal in my presence, not before our wedding, not after. I know that now, Vera said, guilt thick in her throat, but I didn't know it then. I was young, frightened, certain I understood politics I actually barely comprehended. I panicked, convinced our marriage would be the exact excuse they needed to destroy everything my people had left to their names. I thought leaving would prevent a catastrophe I was certain was already in motion. So instead, Draven said, voice dropping dangerously quiet, each word measured and deliberate, you humiliated me before my entire court, vanished in the night without explanation, leaving guests, advisors, my own father, wondering what unforgivable thing I must have done to drive you away. I spent months defending myself against rumors I couldn't even properly address, because I had no idea what accusation I was supposedly guilty of. I know, Vera said, tears finally spilling despite her fiercest effort at composure. I know precisely how badly I failed you, how selfishly I acted, believing my fear justified abandoning you without a single word of warning. I've spent 5 years regretting the cowardice of that decision, wondering whether honesty might have changed everything that followed. Draven studied her for a long, considering moment, old anger and fresh confusion warring visibly behind his amber eyes, firelight from the chamber's single lantern catching the sharp angles of his face.
Why return now? He asked finally, moving to stand near the window rather than sitting across from her. Why not continue hiding, wherever you've spent these 5 years, if guilt alone hasn't been sufficient motivation to bring you back before this particular moment? Vera's throat tightened with fresh shame, each word costing her considerable effort. I built a trading business in the Eastern Territories, shipping goods along the coastal routes. It succeeded modestly for several years, enough that I convinced myself I'd made the right choice, that independence proved worth whatever pain I'd caused you. Then, 6 months ago, it failed badly, undone by a series of bad contracts and worse luck. So you've come seeking rescue, Draven said, something bitter entering his tone, rather than seeking to genuinely make amends for what you did. I came seeking both, Vera said honestly, meeting his gaze despite every instinct urging her to look away. I won't pretend desperation isn't part of why I'm standing here today, Draven. Only a fool would claim otherwise. But I also owe you a truth 5 years overdue, regardless of whatever help you're willing to extend alongside it, or even if you offer none at all. Draven crossed to the window fully now, his broad shoulders rigid with barely controlled tension, staring out at the courtyard below without truly seeing it. You realize what you're asking of me. Protection from whatever debts you've accumulated requires resources, influence, my personal involvement in matters that could easily become political liabilities I can't simply dismiss. I don't expect you to hand me protection freely, Vera said, rising from her chair despite the guard's presence just beyond the door. I only ask for the chance to explain myself properly, and perhaps find some way to earn whatever assistance you're willing to offer, however small. Draven turned back to face her, expression carefully unreadable, though something flickered behind his eyes that Vera couldn't quite identify. The men pursuing you, do you know their names, their reach within this kingdom? The Corvain family, Vera admitted, dread settling cold in her stomach at simply speaking the name aloud. Merchants with considerable underground influence throughout the eastern trade routes, considerably more dangerous than their public reputation suggests to those unfamiliar with their actual practices. Something flickered across Draven's face at this, recognition, perhaps genuine concern breaking through his careful composure. The Corvains are dangerous, Vera, considerably more dangerous than simple debt collectors chasing an unpaid trading loan. I've had reports of their activities crossing my desk for months now. I'm aware, Vera said quietly, exhaustion finally breaking through her careful composure. That's precisely why I had nowhere else left to turn, Draven. You were my last option. However little right I have to ask anything of you after everything I've done. Chapter 2. Draven granted her temporary shelter within the palace walls, though he made clear the arrangement carried no promise of forgiveness beyond immediate safety from the Corvain family's pursuit. He summoned his steward within the hour, issuing instructions in the clipped, formal tone Vera remembered from years ago, back when he'd still been a prince rather than king, still learning how to command a room without raising his voice. "You'll remain in the eastern guest wing," he told her, voice still carrying careful distance despite the small mercy he was extending. "Guards will monitor your movements at all times. This isn't trust, Vera. I want that understood clearly before you mistake shelter for absolution. It's simply practical caution, given the danger apparently trailing you into my kingdom." "I understand," Vera said, grateful for even this much consideration after everything she'd cost him 5 years ago. She followed the steward through unfamiliar corridors, noting how much the palace had changed since her brief time here as a bride-to-be. New wings added, old tapestries replaced, evidence of a king who'd continued building a life she'd once been meant to share. Days passed in careful tension, Draven maintaining polite but thoroughly guarded distance, while his advisors quietly investigated the Corvain family's reach into the capital itself. Vera spent her time attempting to make herself useful rather than simply existing as an obligation within his walls, offering trading expertise to palace merchants struggling with contract negotiations, anything to demonstrate she wasn't simply seeking charity disguised as reconciliation. She found Draven in the palace gardens one evening, nearly a week into her stay, reviewing reports by lantern light with visible exhaustion carved into his features, shoulders hunched in a way she'd never seen from him before, not even during the stressful weeks leading up to their original wedding. "May I speak with you?" she asked carefully, approaching slowly enough that he'd have ample warning of her presence. Draven gestured to the bench beside him without fully looking up from his papers. "What is it?" "I wanted to properly explain what happened 5 years ago," Vera said, settling onto the bench at a respectful distance, close enough for conversation, but far enough to respect whatever boundaries he still needed. "Not simply the panic that drove me away that night, but everything since. The years I spent believing I'd made the right choice, even as guilt slowly convinced me otherwise, piece by piece, until I could no longer ignore it." Draven finally looked up, amber eyes studying her with careful assessment, setting his reports aside entirely now. "Go on then." "I find myself curious, despite considerable effort, not to be. I built my trading business specifically to prove I could survive without royal protection," Vera admitted, twisting her hands together in her lap. "To convince myself that leaving hadn't simply been cowardice dressed up as noble sacrifice, that I'd actually accomplished something meaningful with the freedom I'd chosen over marriage to you and everything it represented." "And when it failed?" Draven asked, something almost gentle entering his tone despite his obvious effort to maintain distance. "I realized how thoroughly I'd deceived myself," Vera said, voice breaking slightly. "The business failing wasn't simply financial ruin, Draven. It was proof that everything I'd told myself about that decision had been built on fear rather than genuine conviction. I ran from a threat that turned out to be imaginary, born from misunderstanding rather than actual danger, and in doing so created a very real one that's now chasing me across the entire kingdom, threatening everything I've built since." Draven was quiet for a long moment, firelight from a nearby lantern flickering across his sharp features.
casting shadows that made him look older than the man she remembered, weighted by years of ruling alone. I searched for you, you know, for nearly a year after you disappeared, sending inquiries to every territory bordering our own, convinced something terrible had happened rather than simple flight. I didn't know that, Vera whispered, fresh guilt settling heavy in her chest.
I told myself it was simply about restoring the alliance our marriage was meant to secure, Draven continued, staring out at the darkening garden rather than meeting her eyes directly. The political consequences of a vanished bride, the questions from neighboring territories, all of it required addressing. It took considerable time, longer than I care to admit, to acknowledge it had become about something considerably more personal than politics or alliance. I'm sorry, Vera whispered, tears finally spilling freely now. For all of it. The fear, the running, 5 years of silence you never deserved from me, regardless of whatever misunderstanding drove that first decision. Sorry doesn't undo 5 years, Draven said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier harshness, softening into something Vera hadn't dared hope to hear again. But I find myself, despite considerable effort to remain angry, as I believe I'm entitled to be, more curious about who you've become than committed to punishing who you once were when fear made your choices for you.
Chapter 3. The Corvain family's threat grew more concrete within the week, a formal messenger arriving at the palace gates just after dawn, demanding Vera's immediate return, alongside full payment for her considerable debt, and threatening unspecified consequences should the crown continue sheltering what the message repeatedly termed a fugitive from legitimate financial obligation. Draven read the letter twice in his study, jaw tightening further with each pass, before finally setting it down on his desk with more force than strictly necessary. Legitimate, he repeated coldly, the word carrying open contempt. Their interest rates border on outright extortion, Vera, and their collection methods have left considerable evidence of violence scattered throughout the Eastern Territories these past several years. I've had reports crossing my desk about the Corvain family for longer than I care to admit, reports I regret not investigating more thoroughly before now. What will you do? Vera asked, anxiety tightening her chest as she watched him pace the length of his study, boots striking stone with sharp, deliberate rhythm. I'll do what I should have investigated years ago, regardless of our history together, Draven said, stopping to face her directly. The Corvain family's practices violate several trade regulations I have full authority to enforce as king.
Whatever debt you owe them, it was accumulated through predatory lending practices that deserve legal challenge, not simple payment that only rewards their continued exploitation of desperate merchants. You'd risk political conflict with them? Vera said slowly, disbelief evident in her voice. On my behalf? After everything I've cost you already? I'd enforce laws that should have been enforced regardless of your particular involvement in this matter, Draven corrected, though something warmer entered his tone, despite his obvious effort to maintain professional distance. You simply happen to be the reason I'm finally paying proper attention to a problem that clearly extends well beyond your individual circumstances, Vera. This isn't charity, it's overdue justice. Vera studied him carefully, searching his expression for any hint of resentment beneath his stated reasoning, finding instead something that looked remarkably like genuine conviction. Thank you, she said quietly. Regardless of your reasoning, thank you for taking this seriously. The confrontation with Corvain's representatives happened 3 days later, in the palace's formal receiving hall, sunlight streaming through tall windows that did nothing to soften the tension gathering among the assembled court officials and guards lining the chamber's edges. Draven presided from his throne with cold, deliberate authority, while his legal advisors presented meticulously gathered evidence of predatory lending practices spanning multiple Eastern territories, documents and testimonies collected over just 3 days, but damning nonetheless.
Your family's debt collection methods violate kingdom trade law on no fewer than 4 separate counts, Draven informed the pale-faced representative directly, voice carrying easily across the silent hall. Effective immediately, all outstanding obligations accrued under these practices are declared void by royal decree, and I'm authorizing full investigation into your family's broader trade practices throughout my territories, beginning within the week. The representative's carefully practiced composure cracked entirely, sweat visible along his brow despite the cool morning air. Your Majesty, with respect, this woman legitimately owes— This woman owes nothing, Draven interrupted, voice sharp enough to silence any further protest. Beyond what any citizen deserves from predatory lenders operating under implicit threat of violence against those unable to pay inflated, illegally structured rates. I'd advise your family reconsider their business practices considerably before I'm forced to investigate matters considerably more thoroughly than this single case currently requires of me. Silence stretched through the hall, broken only by the representative's shallow, anxious breathing. Finally, recognizing the futility of further argument before an Alpha King clearly prepared to follow through on every threat, he bowed stiffly and retreated from the chamber without another word, flanked by guards escorting him firmly toward the exit. Once the representative had departed, thoroughly cowed and considerably paler than when he'd arrived, Vera turned to Draven with genuine amazement written plainly across her face. "You just ended 5 years of running in a single afternoon," she said softly. 5 years of looking over my shoulder, of never staying anywhere long enough to be found. I ended a problem that never should have existed in the first place, Draven said, descending from his throne to stand beside her rather than above her. Your 5 years of running, however, remain considerably more complicated to resolve than a simple legal decree, Vera. That particular that isn't one I can simply void with a signature. What do you mean? She asked, though something in his expression suggested she already understood the direction this conversation was heading. I mean, Draven said, voice dropping lower as he closed the remaining distance between them, close enough now that she had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze properly. That legal protection from debt collectors is considerably simpler to arrange than deciding what actually happens between the two of us, now that the immediate danger's finally been properly addressed. That particular question, I confess, I haven't yet found an easy answer for. Vera's breath caught at the raw honesty in his tone, so different from the guarded coldness he'd maintained since her arrival. Perhaps, she said carefully, we don't need to find that answer today. Perhaps not, Draven agreed, though he made no move to step back for her. But I find myself considerably less patient than I once was about leaving such questions unanswered indefinitely.
Chapter 4. The weeks following Corvain's retreat passed in careful, tentative rebuilding, Draven's guarded distance slowly giving way to something considerably warmer, though neither of them addressed directly what exactly they were rebuilding toward, or whether either dared name it aloud just yet. Vera settled into a rhythm within the palace that felt strange in its normalcy. Mornings spent revealing trade proposals alongside the palace merchants, afternoons occasionally interrupted by Draven himself, finding excuses to seek her counsel on matters that likely required no such consultation at all. You've changed, Draven observed one evening, finding Vera in the palace library surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, genuine focus evident in her expression as she cross-referenced shipping routes against seasonal weather patterns.
5 years of surviving alone teaches considerable resilience, Vera said, setting aside her papers to give him her full attention, something she found herself doing more naturally now than she had in those first tense days of her return. Whether I particularly wanted that education or not, circumstances rather insisted upon it. I find myself grateful for it, Draven admitted, settling into the chair across from her without invitation, though Vera found she didn't mind the informality, despite everything that particular education cost us both along the way.
Though I confessed considerable uncertainty about what comes next, now that immediate danger's passed, and we're left simply facing each other honestly, without debt collectors or political schemes to distract us from the actual matter between us. What do you want to come next? Vera asked carefully, holding his gaze despite the vulnerability the question exposed in both of them. Draven considered this question with visible seriousness, amber eyes studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, despite the weeks of careful, deliberate distance he'd maintained between them since her arrival. He rose from his chair, moving to the tall window overlooking the darkening gardens, hands clasped behind his back in a posture Vera recognized from years ago, the stance he always adopted when working through something difficult. I want honesty, he said finally, turning back to face her directly. Not simply about the past, though heaven knows that matters considerably to whatever trust we're attempting to rebuild. Honesty about what you actually want now, in this moment, Vera. Not obligation born from gratitude for whatever protection I've extended you these past weeks. Not lingering guilt over past cowardice driving your decisions once again. What do you genuinely want, standing here now, with nothing forcing your hand? Vera considered the question with the same seriousness it clearly deserved, aware that her answer would matter considerably more than any explanation she'd offered him since her return.
I want a second chance, she said finally, rising to meet him near the window. Not because I believe I've earned one through these past weeks of careful behavior, but because these weeks with you have shown me exactly what I sacrificed 5 years ago, out of fear rather than genuine conviction about anything real. A second chance, Draven repeated slowly, something guarded still present in his tone, despite the warmth beneath it. At marriage? At the alliance our fathers originally arranged between our two territories, back when neither of us had any real say in the matter? At you, Vera corrected softly, closing the remaining distance between them entirely. The alliance matters considerably less to me now than the man I abandoned at that altar 5 years ago. The man who just spent an entire afternoon defending me before his own court without hesitation. I'd like the chance to choose you properly this time, Draven. Not through arrangement, not through political obligation, but through genuine choice, freely made with full understanding of everything that choice actually requires of me. Draven's expression softened entirely, whatever remaining guardedness he'd carried finally dissolving as he reached out to gently tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering longer than strictly necessary for the small gesture. I've spent 5 years telling myself I no longer wanted that particular chance, he admitted quietly, convincing myself that anger alone was sufficient, that I'd moved past whatever I'd once felt for you.
I find I've been lying to myself rather thoroughly this entire time, Vera, and rather badly at that. He kissed her then, unhurried and certain, 5 years of separation finally dissolving into something considerably more solid than either had believed possible when she'd first appeared, desperate and ruined, at his palace gates weeks before. When they finally broke apart, both breathing and steadily, Draven rested his forehead gently against hers. I'm not offering this lightly, he murmured. Whatever we rebuild from here, I intend for it to last considerably longer than our first attempt managed. Then let's build it properly this time, Vera whispered back, with nothing hidden between us ever again.
Chapter 5. Their second wedding, when it finally happened 2 months later, looked considerably different from their first attempt 5 years earlier. Smaller in scale, quieter in celebration, built on honesty rather than simple political arrangement between two territories seeking mutual advantage. Vera stood in her chambers hours before the ceremony, staring at her reflection in a mirror that felt considerably less intimidating than it had during her first panicked attempt at this same moment 5 years before. Draven found her there, knocking softly before entering, dressed in formal ceremonial attire that made him look every inch the king his people had come to respect during his years ruling alone. "You're certain?" he asked, crossing the room to stand behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror's reflection rather than turning her to face him directly. "That this is truly what you want, not obligation, not gratitude for protection extended, but genuine choice, freely made without fear driving your decision this time?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my entire life," Vera said, turning to face him properly now, taking his hands in hers with steady confidence that would have seemed impossible to her 5 years ago. 5 years ago, fear made my choice for me, convinced me that running represented protection, rather than cowardice dressed in noble justification. "This time, I'm choosing you completely, Draven, with full knowledge of everything that choice actually requires, and no illusions remaining about the difficulty that might yet lie ahead of us." "Then I have something to give you," Draven said, producing a small velvet box from within his formal jacket, "before we stand before that altar again, properly this time, with nothing hidden between us." Inside was a simple silver ring, considerably less elaborate than royal tradition typically demanded for a queen's wedding band, its simplicity feeling entirely appropriate given everything they'd rebuilt together these past 2 months through patient, deliberate honesty. "I chose something different from what tradition expects," Draven explained, sliding it gently onto her finger. "A reminder that whatever we're building now isn't obligated to follow the same path we originally attempted 5 years ago, back when neither of us truly understood what we were promising each other." The ceremony itself passed in warm, genuine celebration, considerably smaller than the original elaborate affair Vera had fled 5 years before, guest lists trimmed to those who'd actually supported Draven through the difficult years of ruling alone, rather than the extensive political gathering their first attempt had demanded. Sunlight streamed through the chapel's tall windows, catching dust motes floating lazily in warm afternoon light, as Vera walked the short aisle toward Draven, steady and certain in ways her younger self could never have managed. "Do you take this woman?" the priest asked, voice carrying easily through the intimate gathering, "as your true wife and queen, freely chosen rather than politically arranged, in honesty rather than obligation?" "I do," Draven said, amber eyes never leaving Vera's face throughout the entire exchange. "More certainly than anything I've committed to during my entire reign as king, including decisions I once believed carried far greater weight than this particular promise." When Vera spoke her own vows moments later, voice steady and certain in ways it hadn't been 5 years before, she felt every fragment of old guilt and fear finally settling into something considerably more peaceful than she believed herself capable of feeling again. "I do," she said clearly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, "and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that this particular choice was the right one, today and every single day that follows it." Draven kissed her then, before their gathered guests. 5 years of separation finally completely resolved into the marriage that fear had once stolen from them both, through a single night of panicked, misguided flight. The small crowd erupted into genuine celebration, considerably warmer than the polite applause their first ceremony had never actually received, given how thoroughly that earlier attempt had ended before it properly began. "Welcome home," he murmured against her lips, low enough that only she could hear it.
Properly this time, with nothing left unsaid between us. "I'm not going anywhere," Vera promised, resting her forehead against his the same way he had weeks before, in that quiet moment beside the window, when everything between them had finally begun shifting toward this exact moment. "Not ever again, Draven. Whatever comes next, we face it together, honestly, starting today."